This morning, a shipping manifest from the Port of Sept Isles crossed my desk, and it confirmed what the trade data has been whispering for months. The North American aluminum corridor, a lifeline of industrial integration that functioned for decades, has been permanently severed. We aren't looking at a temporary trade dispute or a tactical negotiation maneuver. We are witnessing the structural hemorrhage of one of the most vital supply chains in Western history. For 40 years, the flow of metal from Quebec smelters to American factories was as reliable as the tides. Today, that flow has reversed, redirected, and ultimately locked into a new geopolitical architecture that Washington's architects of the 2025 tariff regime never saw coming. The sequence of this collapse is a masterclass in unintended consequences. It began in February 2025, when the Trump administration reimposed Section 232 tariffs, hiking the rate to 25% and stripping away the exemptions that had previously allowed Canadian producers to operate as integrated partners. That was the opening tremor. By June 4, 2025, the administration doubled down, slamming a 50% duty on aluminum imports. They framed it as industrial protection, a shield intended to force the resurrection of dormant American smelters. Instead, it acted as a blunt force eviction notice for Canadian metal. The math of the pivot is unforgiving. Before the tariffs, Canadian aluminum was essentially an extension of the US industrial base, with over 90% of output heading south. Today, Canadian producers like Rio Tinto and Alcoa have effectively abandoned their primary customer. The redirection is absolute. Canadian shipments to Europe have skyrocketed by 276% year over year, while deliveries to the United States have cratered by 25%. This is not a shift in marketing. It is a structural rerouting of raw, foundational industrial power. Look at the company level to understand the speed of this displacement. Aluminary Alouette, North America's largest smelter, saw its European export share surge from a negligible 4% to a staggering 57% in the months following the 50% tariff imposition. This is not a marginal adjustment. This is a deliberate contractual realignment. The largest producers have stopped chasing the American market, which now demands a 50% tariff premium, and are instead signing multi-year supply agreements with European buyers hungry for low-carbon metal. The US administration's gamble that they could choke supply and force a domestic industrial rebirth was built on a failure to account for the real why of the US domestic landscape. The United States currently operates only 4 primary aluminum smelters, with a total production capacity that barely touches 4% of its annual demand. There is no domestic capacity to fill the void. When Canada walked away, the US was left with a desperate, self-inflicted vulnerability, forcing it to turn to the Middle East to fill a massive, record-breaking supply gap. By the end of 2025, the UAE and Bahrain had become the primary stopgaps for US industrial needs, supplying over 21% of all American aluminum imports. The strategy seemed to hold for a fleeting moment, but it was built on sand. The moment the conflict in the Strait of Hormuz ignited on February 28, 2026, those supply lines didn't just flicker, they were effectively incinerated. With the destruction of major smelters in the Emirates and Bahrain, and the concurrent gas supply shutdown of Qatar's Qatalum facility, the alternative corridor has been neutralized. The American industrial base is now staring into a void. US Midwest premiums have hit an all-time record of $2,557 per tonne, a number that represents not just a cost, but a warning of systemic failure. Lead times for specialty aluminum products have pushed out to 60 weeks, strangling the very manufacturers the tariffs were intended to protect. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, has provided a permanent, structural incentive for Canadian producers to stay right where they are. Quebec's hydroelectric-powered smelters are the gold standard for low-carbon production, making them the most valuable supply source under Europe's deepening green industrial regime. While Washington is still debating tariff rollbacks, Europe is building the infrastructure to lock in Canadian supply for the next decade. The Canadian metal has not just left the building, it has moved into a more advantageous neighbourhood, and the doors have been bolted shut with long-term, carbon-compliant contracts. The US administration tried to strong-arm a critical partner and inadvertently handed the European Union a strategic advantage in the race for clean, reliable, and essential industrial resources. The North American trade corridor is not merely broken. It has been fundamentally re-engineered by the very policies that were supposed to preserve its dominance. The most critical question for every Canadian firm, investor, and policymaker is no longer whether we can get back into the American market, but how long we can sustain this new, superior footing before the pressures of continental proximity force a second, perhaps more dangerous, act of this drama. The cliffhanger isn't just about whether the supply corridor can be rebuilt. It's about whether the architects of American trade policy even realize they are building in a ruin. As we approach the July 1, 2026 CUSMA review, the narrative from Washington is one of leverage. The official story is that the Section 232 tariff architecture, codified in the April 2026 proclamations and enforced as of June 8, is a tool to force North American alignment and secure the US industrial base. But that is the facade. The reality is a deal architecture that has effectively decoupled the Canadian aluminum sector from the American Midwest, creating a bifurcated market that no amount of late-night treaty renegotiation can easily stitch back together. To understand why this is permanent, you have to look at the three specific pillars that define this new, fragmented reality. First, the stacking trap. The 2026 tariff regime introduced a methodology shift that is far more punishing than the headline numbers suggest. By applying the 50% Section 232 duty on the full value of derivative aluminum products rather than just the metal content, the US administration effectively turned every Canadian manufacturer into a high-risk liability. For firms like Rio Tinto or Alcoa, the compliance cost of navigating the new HSUS subheadings is now a structural barrier to entry. They haven't just lost a price advantage, they've inherited a tax burden that makes the US market a secondary concern. Companies are no longer choosing to sell to Europe. They are mathematically prohibited from competing in the US without eroding their margins to the point of insolvency. Second, the 85% content mirage. The administration introduced a US sourcing incentive, offering a reduced 10% tariff rate if 85% of the aluminum content is smelted and cast in the United States. This is the centerpiece of their reindustrialization strategy. But the arithmetic is absurdly disconnected from the supply chain's actual capacity. With only 2 of 4 domestic smelters operating at full capacity, the US does not have the primary aluminum output to feed its own downstream manufacturers, let alone meet an 85% domestic content threshold for the entire industrial sector. It is an impossible condition, a gate that has been locked when the key doesn't exist. This effectively creates an incentive that forces manufacturers to either source from the limited, high-cost domestic pool or pay the full 50% penalty, further incentivizing the very shift toward European markets where carbon compliance is the only barrier, not a manufacturing impossibility. Third, the CBAM integration. This is the move that most analysts in Washington are consistently underestimating. The EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism isn't just a regulatory hurdle, it has become a market maker. Because Canadian smelters in Quebec are powered by hydroelectricity, their carbon intensity is so low that they effectively bypass the most aggressive layers of European carbon pricing. While an American manufacturer is struggling to source melted and poured metal within a broken domestic system, a European buyer is signing long-term contracts for Canadian aluminum that arrives with a clean certification. These contracts are legally binding, multi-year commitments. They are the new architecture of Canadian sovereignty in the metals market. What Washington is signalling with the July 1 review is that they expect a return to the status quo through tighter rules of origin and higher regional value content. But the deal architecture they are proposing is a relic of a pre-war, pre-tariff and pre-carbon tax world. They are trying to negotiate the terms of a trade relationship that has already migrated across the Atlantic. The USMCA review was meant to be the mechanism for stability. Instead, it is becoming the funeral for the integrated North American aluminum supply chain. While the negotiators sit down in July to discuss rules of origin, the producers have already closed their books on the American market. The question is no longer whether we can influence the US position. It is whether the US can build the domestic capacity to prevent their manufacturing base from being starved of essential metal by their own trade policy. The structural severance of the North American aluminum corridor, driven by the reckless imposition of Section 232 tariffs and the subsequent collapse of the Middle Eastern supply alternative, has effectively forced Canadian producers to anchor their future to Europe. We have transitioned from an era of integrated continental dependency to a reality of permanent trade diversion, where Canadian metal is no longer a domestic reserve but a global commodity traded at a premium in markets that actually value its low-carbon pedigree. Chem-analysts, the strategic implications of this shift are profound and, for the United States, potentially catastrophic. For decades, the Canada-US relationship was defined by the assumption that proximity equated to security. Today, that assumption is dead. By attempting to use tariffs as a blunt force instrument for protectionism, Washington has achieved the exact opposite of its stated goal. It has hollowed out its own supply chain, inflated the cost of its foundational industrial inputs to record levels, and ceded its most reliable partner to a European regulatory orbit. The US manufacturing base is now caught in a pincer movement, suffering from both the absence of cheap, high-quality Canadian metal and the reality that its own domestic smelter capacity is a ghost of its former self. This is not a temporary disruption, it is a fundamental realignment. The European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, has acted as the unintended magnet, creating a structural pricing advantage that no US protectionist measure can counteract. Because Quebec's smelters are powered by clean hydroelectricity, they are perfectly optimised for the EU's green industrial regime. Every tonne of aluminum that finds a home in Germany or Italy is a tonne that will not return to the American Midwest. These trade relationships are now codified in multi-year, high-premium contracts, and the infrastructure to move this metal across the Atlantic is being hardened as we speak. The contrast with the pre-Trump era is sharp. We have moved from a rules-based, predictable trade environment to a regime of executive discretion and volatility where the rules of origin are a moving target. Canadian sovereignty now depends on our ability to play the global market with the same cold, analytical detachment that our partners are using against us. We are seeing the rise of a Buy Canadian framework not as a nationalist slogan, but as a survival mechanism in a world where the United States has unilaterally broken the trust that underpinned the entire USMCA architecture. As we look toward the July 2026 CUSMA review, the illusion of a negotiated solution remains the most dangerous element of the current landscape. Washington is still operating under the premise that they can force Canada back into the old subservient supply role through threats of withdrawal or punitive quotas. But the market has already moved on. The aluminum is going to Europe because that is where the value is, that is where the policy is aligned, and that is where the growth is occurring. Capitol Hill Group, the next critical decision point will not be the outcome of the treaty review itself, but the moment the Canadian government stops trying to appease the American administration and instead commits fully to the European integration strategy. We are witnessing the end of a century-long dependency on the American industrial machine. The real question is whether our policymakers will lean into this new, diversified reality or continue to wait for a Washington that is effectively burning its own bridge behind them.